All right. Thank you very much for having me remotely this afternoon, um, and for the leadership there putting this all together for us. I know it's a big task, and I really do appreciate that as I'm presenting here from Denver, Colorado at a gathering of geographers in another conference. So today I'm going to be talking about some work I've been doing that's built from previous ventures in sound mapping and sound studies, looking at prehistoric sites, Indigenous voices, and preserving identities. And so just an outline of what I'll look at today, give a basic introduction to the field in which I'm working, provide my research objectives and study area, talk about the methods I used, the data, and then discuss some of the results in this preliminary round of research with my collaborators, and then some discussion and some of the limitations of my research. So what I've been working in for this project is a field of acoustic archaeology, trying to bring back a sensory understanding of a prehistoric past. So some of the work I'll talk about later has dealt with historic pasts, but we wanted to venture in looking at how archaeologists and anthropologists can use soundscapes and sound studies to really get a better understanding and a more in-depth understanding of prehistoric places and times, and how that could be used and valued as a way to engage current citizens, Indigenous groups, and just the general population in these places that they're exploring. And so there's been quite a bit of work in this field already on trying to collect and create soundscapes of prehistoric places in areas of audio archaeology by Stephen Miles, and also by David Witt, who have worked on trying to think about the propagation of sound and its spread through prehistoric places. So they were more concerned with how to collect sound in situ in these places and how it would spread through that space. And so how the indigenous and prehistoric peoples would have heard that sound. But they weren't really thinking too much about how that then affects the researcher, the archaeologist on the dig, and also the people that we're trying to communicate this information to. And then some of the other projects that were more historic that kind of helped precipitate how we would go about this project. One of them you heard from earlier in the week at the conference was the Moravian Soundscapes project, which looked at the historic soundscapes. And then another project was a Mission San Luis project, looking at a recreated mission space in Tallahassee, Florida. And again, that's a historic space, so there's record on what sounds were there, what it was like, and how it was experienced. And then a project that I did previously was Soundscapes of the Hudson River, which looked at people's soundscapes and experiences in the 1980s. So it was a challenge trying to look at these prehistoric sites, but utilizing some of the tools and technologies we had created and engaged with in these various other projects where there was a lot more data and information available. So the objectives for what we were trying to do, firstly, just create and examine these stone rock wall structures in Northeast Alabama. And I'll talk more about what these rock walls are in a little bit. But as a way to create an effective experience of these indigenous spaces so that the public could better appreciate these areas. The colleague I've been working with has been doing digs and site inspections in these places for 40 years. But there's not been much collaborative engagement with these spaces, with the public or with the indigenous descendants of these spaces, because he was just writing reports for the government. So we also wanted to examine interactions between sound and space using these acoustic archaeology techniques and methods that we've collected to not only see how prehistoric people might have engaged with the space, but how current researchers and students engage with the space, and how descendants of those prehistoric individuals engage with the space. And then look at a way to create a participatory mapping platform where Indigenous participants could actually provide and be heard in this recreation of a sounded ancestral homeland. So there are two research areas that I'm focusing on for the project. They're both in East Alabama, and as a geographer, I probably should have created you some maps, but they're Morton Hill, which is one of the highest peaks in the area. And this is one of the rock wall structures that I mentioned earlier. This is a large prayer seat. So prehistoric individuals would have come up to this site. They carried all of these rocks up here, and they built this prayer seat. And this is on Morton Hill, a sacred space compared to the everyday space of the village that we'll look at in a second. So this was one of my sites where we saw many of these rock structures being created, and seeing how laborious it was to create these because they're carrying these things all up the mountain. And so in this map, it's just a topographic map from the USGS. We can see here on the screen the little flag where it says CA 625 is the village site. And that's the site that has been dug and examined for over 40 years. And we see the path that these indigenous inhabitants would have had to take to get up to that Morton Hill prayer seat, which is this red line here, and actually goes off the map just slightly. And that's where they would have carried all of these quarried rocks up this mountain to create these structures. And that's just showing that. So how we approached the project was through soundscape mapping, trying to take the soundscapes that we collect in the field and put them into a mapping software so we can actually engage with them as they are in place. We also utilize field recordings and interviews and ask participants to do sound journals, and then also collected surveys and conducted some participatory mapping. Excuse me, in terms of asking participants to map the spaces that they were engaging with. And then finally, to take all of that information and to create immersive story maps, which are maps that contain more than just a clip of sound or an image, but they actually contain some of the narrative, some of the journals that the participants would have collected. So the field work, as I said, was conducted on Morton Hill and Baines Gap. And I provided this map just to show an example of what these structures look like. So they're immense structures that would have taken hundreds of years to put together, and we have records of, in terms of dating of some of these, how long they've been there, and the ones closest to these two springheads at the bottom have been there the longest. And what these prehistoric inhabitants would have done is taken these stone structures up the mountain, and they created this amphitheater type structure. It doesn't exactly look as it should. These brown lines are the contour lines, and they specifically structured these rock walls along the contours through erosion. And then, of course, when the US government came in, they have an army base right on this mountain, and they exploded ordnances during the Second World War there. They had to create fire break roads. And so they displaced many of these structures. And so they don't exactly follow the contour lines as they would have, but they do create this amphitheater effect. And one of the aspects of this that we were most interested in was at the top, which is off the map here, is where those large prayer seats are, and there are quite a few of them. And they create like a funnel effect down to the spring head, and the spring leads directly back to the village. And so one of the aspects that we're continuing to work on, we haven't completed this, is to see how sound propagates through this space from the prayer seats at the top of the mountain down through this amphitheater that was created, and then down the springs to the village. And the other field technique we used, aside from the digs, which I'll talk about in a moment, was remote sensing and ground penetrating radar. We were trying to capture the structure of the village to see how sound would have propagated through the village and how inhabitants would have engaged with each other in the village. And through the 40 years of digs, you can see all these little tiny squares. Those are all the plots of 2x2 squares that they dug over these 40 years. And it doesn't even cover a very, not even a mile swath of land. So we wanted to use remote sensing technology to try to capture what this village would have looked like to better understand this propagation of sound in space, something that's missing from some of the other research in this field. And this is just an imagery. We did come into some problems trying to do this, in that we had a lot of canopy cover, and the technology is new to some of us, and so we didn't know exactly how to get rid of that. And so we worked on that. This image is from the summer, and within the past couple of months, we've managed to get rid of the canopy cover, and we're about to go do a second run of this with the ground penetrating radar in June. And in June is when the field school happens. So aside from going out and doing the field work and collecting data on these spaces, one of the aspects of the project was actually being on the dig. So how these spaces are experienced now, and when we're finding artifacts from this time period, how that's influencing us as listeners and engaging with this space, and how it can inform other people who are going to engage with the space. This dig we did last year. The College of the Muskogee Nation, who is our partner in this from Oklahoma, was not there, but they've been invited to come this coming summer, and some of them will. And so we'll actually have some descendants of the prehistoric communities coming to engage in these spaces, and I'm sure we'll get some very different perspectives. But part of that soundscape is not just the prehistoric past, but the soundscape we're creating as we're trying to engage with that past. And so I'll just play a quick clip of one of the field schools we did last year.
You take it.
Yeah, we have to share it. Yeah, just May I pour you some dirt? Please. Yes. I didn't know if it was your part or it was the underpin.
And so it's just, there isn't much there in terms of prehistoric sound, but the idea is there's the use of terminology that is very different from what we would do in other fields to understand these spaces. And that can be connected with some of the Indigenous terminology. When they came out to talk with us after the dig, they talked about, for example, the points, which are arrowheads. The archaeologists call them points, and you'd hear that in some of the recordings, and how they engage with it is very different. And so we're going to look this summer on how the descendant communities engage with these spaces, excavating some of their homelands. And I'll provide the PowerPoint, which has a bunch of sound recordings in them as well. And so another part of that was the artifacts that are found, of course, are sounded artifacts. All of them would have been associated with some sound of some type. And so part of this project was to try to recreate some of these soundscapes, and not just soundscape compositions, but the elements that would have went into that. And so, as we just mentioned, the spear points or the arrowheads or points, they of course were sounded when they were created. And one of the individuals who comes on the dig is from the descendant community, and he's also worked with many of the groups out in Oklahoma to learn how to do flint knapping, which is the creation of these. And so he was part of this as well, to kind of reintroduce some of these sounds into the space. And what was very meaningful was he did the flint knapping in the space as they were doing the dig. And he had to do it on a blue tarp so as not to disturb any of the dig site where they're pulling out prehistoric material. But he is very knowledgeable about the material that's there because he's from the area. And so it's the same material that would have been used by the indigenous inhabitants. And so I'll play a sample of his flint knapping.
These are small flakes. Flakes.
And then to get into the soundscape portion, the research partner we have is the College of the Muskogee Nation from Oklahoma, from the Muskogee Nation. And they came out after we had done some of this, and we created the sound maps and put them together and tested them. And they were going to participate in some of this data collection and creation. And you can see them here with some of my students and some colleagues that came to the visit that they had with us as they were trying to explore their ancestral homelands and begin a partnership to come out this summer and work with us. And so we worked with them on how to go out and create some soundscape recordings and collect soundscapes of this area. And we showed them some different tools and technologies. And I'm going to go through some of these quickly, but they're here. But we also taught them how to do it on their phones. So it's more accessible. If they don't have the equipment, they don't have the technology, they're still able to contribute and be part of this soundscape process. And they went out and collected some of these with us. And one of them I'd like to play, hopefully it'll sound, is one where one of the Muskogee Nation students recorded one of the elders who came and chanted in that large prayer seat at the top of the mountain for us as he prayed for their journey to their return to their homelands.
And they sang a song. It's a morning song. And they sang a song. It's a morning song. And it says that when you first get up, you pray. You pray before your foot hits the floor. So the Ayat it Jesus
and as we're coming up on time, some of the results were these story maps that were created. And they input their information, including narratives and experiences they had while they were in these places. And my students created these connective story maps to these places where they're able to input visuals, soundscape examples, and their journals, and then provide to the larger public and the different communities that we're working with these examples of how we're engaging with these spaces, both past and how they would have been engaged with in the past, presently, and what we're hoping to do with the spaces. And I'm going to skip the discussion just because the limitations, I think, were quite important in that after the students from the Muskogee Nation left, it was very hard to get them to create the story maps. They were happy to engage while they were there, but I think it'll be more of when they come back. It was also difficult to get participation from students, community members, and elders outside of the group that came. And then, of course, we were continually changing our survey design and how we were making our maps for them to have ease of access and ease of use. And these are my future directions, but I'd rather leave some time for questions, which I know is probably a minute, but that's okay.
Thank you, Mark. We'll go ahead and open the room for questions and the Zoom room for questions as well. This is yeah, you got it. The contact information if you have any questions that you think of after this, but please just come up here. You don't even have to raise your hand and just ask questions. Come on up if you can.
Thank you so much for this insightful presentation, Mark. I have a question about actually one point that you had in your future directions, which is about creating soundscape compositions. My question is, how do you consider opening up, or do you consider opening up this amazing kind of pool of data that you multimodal data that you collected, and what kind of maybe ethical implications are there when it comes to opening it up to working collectively, with different communities? Have you thought of it already, or is it something that you might consider in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the idea behind the entire project is to make it public facing, so everyone can have access to these spaces, because many people aren't able to go there. It's not like a tourist destination. There's not much in terms of to engage with, and it's very much difficult to access in terms of you have to go up a mountain, a very steep ride, and you can't do it in a normal car. You have to go up in a four-wheel drive vehicle. So we're trying to make it public facing. In terms of the ethical implications, we have thought of that somewhat because the archaeologists are always considering that in terms of when they're finding material, they always are trying to reappropriate it. And so that was one of the aspects of trying to engage with the Muskogee Nation, who are one of the tribes that have ancestral claims to this space. And we've tried to reach out to other groups to ask them if they wanted to be involved, but many of them have just not. Some of them, such as the Abika Creek and the Porch Creek in Alabama, just weren't interested in doing this type of project, but they were happy to allow us to continue to display our information. We did want them to have the opportunity to have their voices heard, but they weren't interested in participating. So there is an issue of, we are kind of telling their story without their voice, but they're not interested in engaging and are happy to let us go forward, but it's still kind of a concern. And that's why we've tried to work very closely with the Muskogee Nation, because they are very much want to be involved. And in the chat, I've never worked with the Mikisew or Seminole tribes, but that's been asked of me before because I did the work with Dr. Sarah Irely on the Mission San Luis. So it's a consideration, but it's not been something I've done yet, just because I'm in Alabama.